Welcome to Module 5, our final section. So in this section, we are going to talk about how to brew a great cup of tea, no matter what type. We'll also talk about some different brewing methods, different vessels, tea traditions, and pairings. Now, there are many methods for brewing tea, just as there are many different personal preferences for how a cup of tea should taste. I'm going to talk about some general principles and guidelines for brewing a cup of tea. Your job is to learn the rules and then adjust them to find your ideal cup and modify depending on the particular tea that you have in front of you. In terms of drawing the best possible flavor out of the tea leaf, there are only a couple ways that you can really go wrong. Temperature. One of the least understood factors in brewing tea is that temperature matters. So the chart shown offers a guideline for what temperature each category of tea should be steeped at. The most important points, black tea and most herbals like rooibos should be steeped at or just over 100 degrees Celsius. This is water that is sort of coming off a full boil. In your kettle or pot, you'll see big bubbles and lots of steam. So these are signs that the water is hot enough. Trying to steep these teas at a lower temperature will result in a weak brew, which does not draw out the flavor from the tea. We've all had the experience of ordering tea at a restaurant and being presented with a tea bag and little pot of lukewarm water. The resulting cup tastes a bit like dishwater and just doesn't do the tea any credit. On the other hand, other categories of tea, especially green tea, should be steeped at a lower temperature, about 80 degrees Celsius. Using water that is too hot will sort of burn the tea, bringing out undesirable qualities and basically making the tea bitter and one note. This is one of the reasons that many people will say that they don't like green tea, because they've only had it brewed incorrectly and it's been harsh and bitter. You'll know that the water is at the right temperature when you're bringing it to a boil and the first wisps of steam start to appear. If you don't catch it in time and the water boils, just let it cool down for a few minutes or even add some cold water. Oolongs and white tea can handle a little more heat than green tea, but it's safer to err on the side of not hot enough rather than too hot. To find the right temperature, watch your water, use a thermometer, or use one of those fancy kettles that brews to the right temperature. The other way that a cup of tea can go wrong is through time, either not steeping enough or for too long. I'm not going to give you time guidelines at this point because the perfect amount of time for a cup of tea depends on the ratio of tea to water, which we'll talk about in a minute. If tea is not steeped long enough, the flavor will be weak and not fully developed. As an example, and my personal pet peeve, think of a tea bag of black tea in a mug. If you add milk before the tea is fully steeped, you're cooling down the water and basically stopping the steeping process. So the result is weak, milky, sort of slightly tea-flavored water. However, if you steep a tea for too long, especially if you're going to drink it neat without milk or sugar, you can bring out negative qualities like bitterness. Once again, this particularly affects green tea. And if you combine water that's too hot with steeping your green tea for too long, you're just not going to have a nice experience. How do you know the perfect time to steep? It depends. Primarily depends on your ratio of tea to water. There are two main methods relevant to this discussion, which I call Western and Asian styles of brewing. In Asian brewing, also known as gongfu cha or making tea with skill, by the way, gongfu can also be pronounced kung fu. So in this style of tea, we use a tiny teapot. The most famous is the Yixing teapot, which is used in traditional Chinese, Japanese, and Korean tea ceremonies, or a gaiwan, which is more casual use. So I've seen this at a nice dim sum restaurant. Either way, whether you've got the tiny teapot or a gaiwan, the principle is the same. You use a small vessel, high ratio of tea to water. So you fill that little pot or gaiwan with dry tea, add water, and then just steep a few seconds, pour off the finished brew, and serve it in a small cup. And then you can repeat this, sometimes up to 20 times, depending on the tea used. As a side note, usually the tea leaves are rinsed as a part of this process. The first steeping is about 15 seconds and the result is discarded. The idea is generally to rinse off any dust as well as wake up the leaves, particularly with a tightly rolled oolong, so you just start getting the steeping process going. So this sort of Asian style method of brewing requires some finesse and seems more art than science to me. I find it works to start with a couple of slightly longer steeps, maybe 30 seconds, followed by some much shorter steeps, as small as 10 seconds, and then slowly increase the steeping time as the leaves start to get tired. On the other hand, we have Western brewing. So Western brewing is sort of the European style as you would see in English style afternoon tea or breakfast tea. The brewing vessel could be a teapot, mug, or maybe a more modern French press. You add tea, add water, and then wait the appropriate amount of time. Compared to Asian style brewing, the Western method uses a large vessel and a low ratio of tea to water. Officially, you want to weigh out 2.5 grams of dry leaf per 6 to 8 ounce cup, a classic English teacup. If you want to eyeball it, like I do, for most dense teas like black tea, 1 rounded teaspoon will do just fine. For lighter, less dense teas like white teas, 1 teaspoon might not be enough. If you're using tea bags, the standard measure is 1 tea bag per cup in a teapot, but I find that there's a lot of variation in tea bags, so you have to use what works best for you. Sometimes with Western brewing, you can get 2 steeps using this method, but usually the second round is not so good. So here are your time guidelines. As we discussed, Asian style brewing is to have quick infusions and steep the leaves many times. In Western style brewing, we have our 2.5 grams of tea per cup, or rounded teaspoon, and the amount of time next depends on the type of tea. Typically, we use 2 minutes for green tea, 2 to 3 for oolong, 4 for black tea, and herbals to taste. Some, like rooibos, can steep even longer because they don't become bitter like Camellia sinensis does. For tea bags, usually the time to steep is less than for full leaf tea. This is because tea bags use finer cut or broken tea leaves. They have greater surface area exposed to the water and release their flavor faster. Now, one aspect of perfect tea preparation that Western style brewing does not take into account is a mechanism to stop the steeping when the tea is ready. And this can allow the leaves to oversteep and become bitter. So when steeping loose leaf tea, I recommend using a basket style infuser. It allows the leaves space to expand while they're brewing, and then the infuser can be removed from the mug or teapot when the tea is ready. Or of course, a French press does this trick fairly well as well. All right, so now that you have mastered the art of brewing a perfect cup of tea, you're probably hungry and ready to pair something with that cup. There are 2 main principles for pairing food with tea. The first is complementary flavors. The theory with a complementary pairing is that you're looking at similar notes in the food and tea and putting them together. This works well with delicate flavors because one doesn't overpower the other. In addition to the flavor and aroma notes, you should consider the body and mouthfeel of the 2 paired items. So a good example of a complementary pairing would be a ripe peach with white tea. You also find that the marine notes in Japanese green tea complement fish in sushi. You can also do a complementary pairing with strong flavors if they're equally weighted, such as a smoky lapsang souchong with a smoked beef brisket. Something that I expect wouldn't work would be dark chocolate with white tea, because the chocolate would just overwhelm the tea. The other principle to use for pairing is contrasting flavors. So in a contrast pairing, you're looking for different notes to play off one another. Rather than, for example, the smoky brisket with the smoky tea, try a smoky tea with dark chocolate. They're both strong enough flavors that they don't overwhelm each other, and their unique notes can help bring out more dimensions in the other. One of the best pairings that I've had that was a contrast pairing was a fruit-flavored black tea paired with a soft camembert-style cheese. The fruit notes contrasted against the creamy barn notes of the cheese in a beautiful, perfect balance. Around the world, tea is enjoyed with a variety of sweet and savory foods, and in so many different traditional and modern settings. I hope that you've learned some things in this course that will help you enjoy tea even more. In the world of tea, the more I learn, the more I find out I really don't know. So I hope your curiosity is also stimulated and you go out with a curious and open mind to learn ever more as you experience tea in all its glory.